re-import wine. And so Joe Beardsley was here. He then passed the business on to his son, Peter. Peter was the first one to buy a vineyard, first foreigners to buy a vineyard in Maduro. And then it was passed to the grandchildren. And by the time it got to the great-grandchildren, they were mostly women. I think the other thing that's been important is very much the open mind. And that is that, I actually did not grow up in the business. So I married my wife, Natasha, when I was an investment banker. And probably something like 12 years after I met her, my father-in-law asked me to, if I would consider leaving London and coming to Portugal to run the business and take it. And it was very, very important to use a consultant because it gave everybody a chance to have their own opinion without offending anybody.
What does it take for a family business to survive not one generation, not two, but over 3 centuries? Today, I had the privilege of speaking with Adrian Bridge, CEO of the Fladgate Partnership, a family enterprise based in Porto, Portugal, founded 334 years ago. You heard well, 334 years. Long before governance framework existed, long before family protocols were fashionable, long before business schools began studying succession, and yet they endured. In this conversation with Adrian, he shares something deeply powerful. Continuity is not an accident, it's a deliberate design. We will explore with him, and you will see how a 17th century wine merchant built a foundation for centuries of legacy. Why 25 years ago, the family decided to formalize new rules of engagement, and how they created valuation clarity that allowed family members to exit with dignity. How they pruned the tree without breaking the family, and how they are preparing for the next succession. Again, one of the most fascinating aspects of this conversation is that Adrian is not bloodline. He was an investment banker in London when his father-in-law invited him to step into the leadership role and become the CEO. And that decision to choose the best qualified, not just a surname, may be one of the reasons that this business still stands 335 years later. If you care about governance, about family unity, and about legacy beyond your lifetime, this episode is for you. Before we begin, let me take a moment to acknowledge that this episode is sponsored by London Consulting Group. And I say this not just as a sponsor mention, but from first-hand experience. I have seen how they work with family businesses to transform strategy into execution, to professionalize operations without losing entrepreneurial spirit. That balance between performance and purpose is exactly what this episode is about. Now, if conversations like this resonate with you, I invite you to subscribe to the podcast on YouTube or follow us on Spotify. I would love to hear from you which families you would like me to interview next. What topics are keeping you awake at night? What governance challenges are you facing in this time? This is not just a podcast, it's a global conversation about continuity. Let's begin. So once again, welcome to Business in Families, this podcast based and focused for family businesses. I have the honor today to talk to Adrian Bridge, which is the CEO of the Fladgate Corporation. Welcome to all the way from Portugal, by the way. Thank you for being in my podcast, Adrian.
Absolutely, my pleasure, Alex. It's great to join you here from Porto and have a chance to tell you what we've been doing here at the Fladgate Partnership for the last, recently, but obviously we trace our history back, 334 years. So we're one of the older or family companies in the world. So that's, and I think one of the reasons for that, of course, is alcohol hasn't gone out of fashion. So that's the positive news.
Well, the people that are focusing their business in alcohol, in liquors and wine, they say that the behavior of the people is changing. So they're beginning to rethink how they market it and position that way. But going back to what you said, that you're one of the oldest family businesses in the world, 300 and something years. Uh, Walk us through that journey, how everything began almost 4 centuries ago.
Yeah, so I mean, the history of Portugal and the history of Britain are very much interconnected. Indeed, the alliance between the two nations is now the oldest alliance in the world, having just celebrated 650 years of a mutual friendship alliance that we celebrated in 2023. So it's not surprising that at the end of the 17th century, when Britain and France essentially fell out, and they have done many times over the centuries, the taxes that were imposed on French wine were very high. So British consumers, British merchants went to look for new sources of fine wine. And naturally, they came to their old alliance partner, which is here in Portugal, and discovered that in the Douro Valley, which is probably one of the most beautiful wine regions in the world, they were making this fabulous wine. That later on developed to become known as port wine or Porto wine, named after the city right on the Atlantic coast where I live and work, and where we export all of our ports from. But throughout the 334 years we've been a family company, we've essentially been passing the baton down between generations, continuing to invest in our vineyards in the Douro Valley, and of course continuing to invest in the large quantities of stock that we own in order to produce our ports, and now take them to the whole world rather than just simply to the UK.
So, what was the name of this first entrepreneur that began the journey 334 years ago?
So the man's name was Joe Beardsley, and Joe Beardsley was the son of a family who owned a hostelry, which is kind of restaurant, hotel, business center, coffee shop, everything all rolled into one, in Spitalfields in London, called the Ram Inn. And he set off as a young man to source wine from Portugal for the family business. And the family had been involved also in the wool business, so exporting wool from Portugal, and then started to export it to re-import wine. And so Joe Beardsley was here. He then passed the business on to his son Peter. Peter was the first one to buy a vineyard, first foreigners to buy a vineyard in the Douro. And then it was passed to the grandchildren. And by the time it got to the great grandchildren, they were mostly women. And in the end, at that stage, this was in the 1790s, 1800. At that stage, women were not able to own assets in their own name. So the name of the company actually was Webb, Campbell and Gray at that time, being the surnames of the husbands of the great grandchildren of Joe Beardsley. And they hired a man called Joseph Taylor to run the business for them. And that was about the time in the early 19th century when people started to begin to use brand names. So that's why we have, for example, Taylor's. It's Taylor with an apostrophe, because that apostrophe means, from Mr. Taylor. And so, Taylor's Port, he became known. The name stuck, but he was only in the business for about 20 years. But the name has stuck, and it's then passed on down through the female line of succession, pretty much, on and off ever since, and now gets to this level where, my wife and I are the current generation of this extraordinary business.
So many families have the challenge of transitioning from one generation to the next one. And the study of the behavior of the families that have succeeded from one generation to the other started almost 40 years ago, not more than that. But before that, and your family is from 334 years ago, what do you think was the main things that made it possible to make the successful transition from one generation to the next one? Is it what?
Well, I think various aspects matter. Obviously, I sort of joked earlier that alcohol's never gone out of fashion. So we have been able to make a product that, despite changes and challenges in occupations, wars, and so on, people have still sought to buy our product. So that being still relevant is important. And we look at many family business around the world where simply they have been outgrown by technology, and if they weren't able to maintain their relevance, the business sector disappeared. The horse and cart would be a pretty good example, replaced by the motor car. But a fine example to the other side of that would be Hermes, who used to make bridles and saddles, who then evolved into a luxury brand. And so no longer really care whether people use a horse or don't use a horse, because they are, a luxury brand. But in the wine business, we've been able to stay relevant. I think the other thing that's been important is very much the open mind, and that is that I actually did not grow up in the business. So I married my wife Natasha when I was an investment banker, and probably something like 12 years after I met her, my father-in-law asked me to if I would consider leaving London and coming to Portugal to run the business and take over from him. So I think it is also important to sometimes look to the broader family and look for the people who are perhaps best able to run the business, rather than just purely a question of bloodline. I think the third thing that I would point to in our particular case is that we've been very strong over the years of sort of pruning the family tree. So, despite being this old, we don't have lots and lots of shareholders. And of course, the relevance of that is when you have many, many minority shareholders who all get a very small economic return, particularly in the capital intensive business, the pressure for people to realize their assets and sell becomes quite high. And we've been able to avoid that by having a pruning of the tree approach, which has worked for us, and we have rules in place, and we have a family protocol which will also ensure that that sort of approach continues into the future. So I think these are all important and contributing factors. And over and above it all, then, is that we recruit and employ the best talent we can get in the market, not purely recruiting only on the basis of whether somebody is family or is not family.
And what about what's called family dynamics? Because one of the main causes that families tend to fail in terms of the transition is the lack of being trustworthy and communication, and also preparing the next generation. What has your family have done over the centuries in those terms to foster open communication and preparing the next generations to be part of something that happened and begun 234 years ago, which is far away from when it began?
Yeah, and I think it would be fair to say also that the challenges related to that are much more relevant today than perhaps they were generations ago. Because generations ago, you were able to bring in the next family member, and they tended typically to work their way up from the bottom of the business, and therefore gained the experience and gained the inherent knowledge of how the business operated and the people that were within it. Today, I think the dynamic is very different. And I think that no family business simply needs someone to join at the bottom of the tree and work their way up. I tend to look at family businesses as being easy to join but hard to leave. And by what that I mean is that very often, people might have completed university, they're brought back into the family business with that opportunity to gain some experience. And then after they've done that, 3 or 4 years later, when they are beginning to be quite useful to the business, they then want to go and sort of fly the coop and gain some more experience. And so my view would be, instead of joining early, join later, go out, get the experience elsewhere in the world and with other businesses, and then come back with a skill or particular market knowledge or particular know-how or technology or whatever that allows you to really bring value straight into a business. And I think that in today's world is probably more important than perhaps in prior generations. But to answer your question specifically, we do have a family protocol. We do regular family meetings. We keep people informed as to what we're doing and why we're doing, and we try to keep them involved. But I remember 25 years ago when I led the process of creating that family protocol. The consultants that we used. And it was very, very important to use a consultant because it gave everybody a chance to have their own opinion without any offending anybody. But the consultant made a very strong point about it and saying, look, imagine you're in an executive jet and you've got your management in the cockpit and there's a lot of buttons and they're flying the plane. As a passenger, you're perfectly entitled to ask, what height the plane's flying at, how fast it's moving, knowing its destination. All of these you're entitled to know, but you're not entitled to go into the cockpit and start pressing buttons because you simply don't know what that'll do to the aircraft. And I think that comment to me was really, really important. So we do have this strong divide between what management has to do to run the business, to fly the plane as the pilot, but equally knowing that we have valuable passengers on board who, quite rightly want to know as much information as they can, but not interfere in a way that it could damage or harm the business. And it's a delicate balance in companies because very often, as we know in family dynamics, things get personal faster than perhaps they should do. So staying in that professional sphere is tough, and that's why you write a rule book.
So going back 25 years, you said that you were part of this team or maybe heading the team to develop the new rules of engagement for the family. I would call it that way. But before that, when you received the call of your father-in-law, you were in London, you were an investment banker, and say, what did to invite you to take his seat or begin to work with him and eventually become the CEO? What triggered in your mind that made you consider in a serious way this opportunity to run a family business that you were coming from a background of financials in terms of investor banking and you were living in London, and that would mean moving to Porto? What triggered in your mind that you can share with the audience in that sense? And something else before you answer that question is that it's not that common to have in-laws, not bloodline, invited to the table in that sense. It's not that common worldwide.
I agree it's not that common, but I think, in today's competitive world, you need to look for the talent which you can find. And if it is in in-laws, and not necessarily in bloodline, then that is close to the family. Obviously, there are issues that relate to that because if in-laws disappear because of the marriage doesn't work out, that creates different challenges. And in our particular case, we resolve that by ownership sitting just in bloodline, and in-laws do not have ownership.
Okay.
But to answer your question about the change from investment banking, which was highly lucrative business, and I was there in the late 80s, early 90s, when it really was quite a good time. I think the rationale from my perspective is that one of the advantages of being in investment banking is you make lots of money. The question is then what you do with it. And what better than to use your money that you might have got from purely investment banking, trading, or whatever, and then put it into a real business that has real impact in the economy, employs real people, and really has tremendous community value. And I could have done that and created the wealth, and then created a company that allowed me to do that. Equally, I was being offered the opportunity to take an extraordinary business on for the next generation, and to immediately, if you like, engage with a real company that was at the top of its game. The concern in my mind was very much of what additional value can I bring to the business, because I'm quite ambitious to see things grow and continue to evolve, and wanting to do that rather than to come here simply to caretake. And the conversation I had with my father-in-law was very much, yeah, we can. There's lots we can do. As an outsider, I could see, quite clearly, there were tremendous opportunities within our industry, and I've helped very much to consolidate the industry since joining. And these are, these were important decision, factors in reaching a decision. But you're absolutely right, Alex. I mean, to leave somewhere and essentially put all your eggs in one basket, that is a risk. But it was done because the extraordinary opportunity to spend a career leading an already very old company and putting it in good position for future generations has been an extraordinary privilege, and one that I shall continue to do for a few more years, perhaps, before the next generation, takes over.
And maybe being part of some more meaningful and not being seen like the bullfight from the rings and being inside of the bull ring, uh, trying to handle things. I think that would make it something very appealing to you, because you were used to handle money, make a lot of money, investments, but now you were handling a real business and the challenges that came with it. Uh, I suppose that was it. One of the things. But the other thing is, when you were sitting on the chair of the CEO, what triggered the necessity to have new rules of engagement, like making a protocol, and how that conversation came out, and how many people you involved, and how were those a difficult conversation? How long they took in order to for the families that are seeing this or hearing it, uh, taking consideration is not an easy path, but pays off a lot.
Yeah, look, I mean, the basic issue is mortality. I I was coming in because my father-in-law was wanting to retire, and it is a tough decision to, or discussion certainly, to have with people and say, you're facing mortalities. There were two other minority um, families where the partners in the business, two other directors who were the same age as my father-in-law, who were involved in minority equity in the business. And so the question is, look, guys, you're three elderly gentlemen. I'm sure you believe you'll live forever, but history tells us otherwise. And so, how are we going to deal with this? And don't leave this until it's too late. Do this at a time when you are willing and able to create the rules of engagement, and that the next generation is young enough to accept that decision and live with that decision taken, so that it becomes cemented into the culture of the family. And I think very often, if you leave things a little bit too late, and then suddenly the founder, the owner, or the next generation is suddenly thrown into the position without a rule book, or with a rule book that's only a year or two old, then they're going to want to try to rewrite the rules. When you've got a rule book that's 20, 25 years old, yes, you might want to relook at some of the specifics of how certain things happen, simply because time moves on. But the essential culture and basis for which the family is involved, um, and how that rule book works doesn't change. And so, yes, we did upgrade it about 5 years ago. We took a very thorough look. Our business had changed. There were certain things in there that we needed to update to reflect that, but the essence remained, and that's been, I think, a tremendous strength. So I would urge, everybody who has a family business, do these things when it's young, and if you can do it when even when you've got very young children, even better, because they will then grow up knowing that there's a rule book and understanding what the expectations of them are, as much as the total rules of business engagement. Where they sit in it. How does that work? And our rule book goes all the way on to things like valuations of the business. So and setting in stone the kind of the approach we take and the discount that would apply if people sell shares to siblings or whatever. I mean, those become important cornerstones, because that allows us as a business, which is highly capital intensive, to again take long-term investment decisions. And nowadays, I think it's the family businesses of the world that tend to have that longer vision or investment horizon. Family business, family offices, which people who are listed on the stock market, quite frankly, their time horizon is being dictated by other people. So these are all the sort of the positives, but clarity, transparency, good communication, then of course underlie everything, and eliminating politics is crucial, and staying professional and leaving family matters to outside the office, essentially, and to not spend all family time talking business.
And you said something interesting, because as part of these new rules was having a clear way of evaluating the company, because as you said so at the beginning of the conversation, you've been having to prune some of the family members because they have a minority stakeholding, and that helps. At least how much it's worth what you have there. Have those conversations when you're pruning, or having the option for somebody to leave the company, because they leave the company but they don't leave the family itself.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point. I think so. Firstly, it's about removing the stigma of somebody selling some of what they have. So people might want to sell partially, and that shouldn't be a stigma within, because people might want to sell for all sorts of reasons. They want to go and create something, their business on their own, and they should be able to do that. I think it's also important to separate the business value from the emotional value. And again, I think in family businesses, people get extremely tied to the emotional value of certain assets, because they might have played an important part in their upbringing and their lives, but they're not necessarily the most important thing for the operational part of the business. And that's often where you end up with a lot of confusion and conflict, because of people's perceptions of what things are really worth. And again, you can bring a lot of clarity to that by having an agreed valuation template, which gives people a simple and easy explanation as to why things are done the way they are. And as I say, if you've had that in place for a long time, it does make it substantially easier for people to accept the outcomes when they come to sell. But in addition to which, we have also another rule, that is that if somebody does sell shares, if the business were then sold within 10 years after somebody has sold some shares, they would get a decline. They would get a amortizing sort of additional value from that sale. Okay. Again, that's designed to stop somebody who tries to corner all the shares and then sell it to a third party and cut out their siblings or whatever from participating in the full value of a transaction. So needs to be dealt with carefully. There's lots of ways to do these things. There's lots of professionals out there that can help, and I think that we've been able to navigate that fairly well.
And in terms of keeping the family together, what are you doing as a family to have all these members that maybe they're not anymore stockholders of the Fladgate, but they're still family members? How do you maintain this unity of having the family together during the years?
Yeah, look, I mean, as in any family, if you make a separation, to a sense, between the family and the blood ties that you have, and perhaps the privilege you've had of being owners of a business, as you quite rightly say, if you're no longer owners of the business, either individually or collectively, you still have those family blood ties. So a lot of the problems that I've seen that occur are because of an exit that one person took wasn't handled in a very professional, transparent way, and then you end up with people feeling that they were somehow taken advantage of, and they it becomes very emotional. And I think the you've got to keep that business side professional. That's why I think third party experts are extremely helpful to bring clarity and to strip away emotion and deal with business and let family deal with being family together and enjoying being family together without everything always going back to a business decision, or why did you do this or do that, or so on and so forth. And these are where the tension points arrive, and they've got to. We have to accept that, and then you have to deal with it.
Do you invite members that are not stockholders of the company in this gathering of the families to foster trust and communication among family members?
Yeah.
And how do you do it?
Well, we do variously. I mean, we have some family events when people come along because they're part of the family, and they even if they're not a shareholder, they may be interested, to know what's going on, and they may still, just because somebody sells some shares, that doesn't mean they lose their pride in the family and what the family has achieved. It just means that they don't have an current economic interest. And also within our scope, we also allow for someone to buy back in where they're sufficient. We have a minimum shareholding, but if they were to be able to buy back in and surpass that minimum, then again they are eligible to come back into the business. So it's not once you're out forever, and it's not you make a decision and you're forever casting out your children. It doesn't kind of work like that. So there is a sense that people still could belong at some stage in the future. And I think again with that, we also bring on board the next generation is hugely important for them to understand the business, understand the dynamics of the business, and why we do what we do, and also for them to see whether they themselves would be interested in employment in the company. And then we have a mentoring system that should they identify an interest and kind of everyone agrees, then there is a mentoring process which would help them achieve being able to enter the family business. So I think there are a number of tools available, but you've got to come at it from a very open and willing perspective, with the understanding that everybody's in the same boat. And they may, as I say, they may well have sold, but that doesn't mean they're no longer proud of the family and what it does. And they are ambassadors. They remain ambassadors for the business. So even if they're no longer shareholders, they can be positive to the business and how the business is perceived. They can play a part even if they're not actually a stockholder.
Okay. In terms of taking care of the next generation and investing in that, preparing the next generation either to become trustworthy owners or work in the company, what do you do as a family indoors and maybe also help them in their visions and ventures outside of the company? Do you have something kind of like a family office in that sense that can help the next generations?
No, we don't operate a family office. I know that many people do, and that obviously provides liquidity and opportunities for family members. We don't do that. We're a very capital intensive business, so we've typically maintained a position where we're reinvesting back into the business, and that hasn't allowed us to set up a family office. But I think we have rules as well in terms of if people are coming in, there are levels of educational qualifications that they should have attained before attempting to come into the company. Because again, if you whilst one would acknowledge that people can contribute at all levels of the business, ultimately here, certainly in a country like Portugal, a family member would probably be expected to be in a more senior position, and therefore, we've got to make sure that they have the educational qualifications as a prerequisite to further training and education that they might need to be able to then join the business and contribute.
So, taking into consideration that 25 years ago you began this journey of having these protocol and these new rules for the family, what has your family done in terms of governance structures, in terms of an advisory board or a board of directors to help you as a CEO tackle the challenges, the strategic challenges of the business?
Yeah, so we run operating boards, and we also have a more advisory board, and we have a board that is made up of what we call the executive family business council, the FBC, and that has a sort of minimum and maximum number of people, and it has its own dynamic as who's the chairman and who can sit on it. But while that organization is there to be informed and to help guide, it doesn't have any fiduciary role, but it has an important voice because it represents the family and how the family is thinking. And I found that to be great. I mean, it works. Again, establishing what the rules of engagement are and what they can and can't decide. And that's something, again, we did when we wrote the protocol 25 years ago, when we set up an EFPC and said, this is what you can do, this is what you can't, this is where you have appointment power. And these are areas where you're entitled to ask for information, but you're not entitled to overrule the executive board of the business. And I think that's worked well for us. I mean, again, I accept that different families will want to tackle this differently, but I do think it's important, particularly in a branded business like ours, that often the family members who've grown up in the company have a very strong sense of what the brand should and shouldn't do. And as long as we're providing them with relevant, up-to-date market information so they can understand the context of decisions, I found it to work extremely well.
So, what about the advisory board? Do you have independence? And if you have so, have it helped you as a CEO tackle the different challenges that business offers?
Yeah, I mean, we have independence, and the importance, I think, of an independent, in my view, is that an independent board member is primarily there to perhaps make up for gaps that you might have in your normal executive board, where there might be a skill gap, or there might be a gap in terms of connections that are required. Maybe there's a political connections, maybe there's an industry or regulatory know-how that's very specific, and you need that independent, and they're not a full executive member of the business. So that non-executive is very helpful. I think it's important that non-executives, in my view, are there to help the business, not there as sort of policemen reporting back to shareholders, because I think a job of a CEO is tough enough without feeling you've got to spend a lot of time sort of protecting your back as well. So we've been extremely fortunate that all the non-executives have very much been on board with the whole overall what is best for the company approach, and on the basis that what's best for the company ultimately will be best for the family. And taking that approach, we've been quite successful in our selections of non-executive directors.
You as a family began this journey of governance in terms of protocol and having this advisory board 25 years ago. And now you're facing as a CEO, and because of age, one of the biggest challenges you have is succession for who's going to take your place eventually, because that's going to happen, you like it or not.
Correct.
And in that sense, what are you doing in that sense to tackle the succession process itself?
Yeah, so it is inevitable. All of us, have our time will come to an end. So the privilege of leading a business, and then knowing when to leave, when you can hand on to younger, fitter, more agile leaders is a crucial process. I think that the view we have in our company is that we also have a very strong middle management. So whilst the next generation hasn't actually joined yet, it probably means there may be some interim leadership that comes from professional management. I think that's also positive. Again, from the perspective of trying to hire the best talent, we want to make sure that we are best equipped with the best talent, and some of those people will have ambition to rise to the top, and they shouldn't see their route blocked entirely by family. But at the same time, our preference is certainly to have family and senior leadership roles, but the right people in the right place. And you're absolutely correct. It is something that now it's certainly occupying more of my time than it was 5 or 10 years ago.
So, did you ever, or the family sees in the future maybe having a female running the business as a
Why not?
CEO?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think we don't. It's a question of employing of skills and ability. It's not whether somebody is whether they're male or female, or they're any other.
The best qualified.
They've got to be qualified, and they've got to be able to lead the business. I think what they, their gender or their particular interests or particular ethnicity, for example, is not the pointed question. It's about having the right people to run a business. Today's business environment is extremely challenging. Right now, I think we're still in a sort of very difficult post-COVID, war shock with Ukraine, post-supply chain disruptions, where we're still not settled, and we've had further challenges on a global basis due to more retrenched nationalistic approaches and tariffs and so on and so forth. I mean, these are all huge challenges that any CEO today has to face, quite apart from, keeping a family business going. So best talent, best person, but also making sure that they're guided and helped where possible is really the task in my view.
So, in this journey of over 25 years of running the business and being the head of the company and being the head of the family, what has been, and you can share with the audience, the biggest lessons that you can give us in those sense for those families that are thinking we have to do something, we're in this journey to transcend for further generations?
Well, I think the first issue is start thinking about it today. In that sense, these sorts of issues are a bit like the answering the question of when is the best moment to plant a tree, and the answer to that is 10 years ago. So you start, the sooner you start, probably the better. I think certainly in my perspective, I think it was crucial that we used external consultants to help us to not only explain best practice, but also to perhaps ask the difficult questions that and tackle the elephants in the room that are inevitably there in any sort of family organization, and to bring those out and to solve those issues before they become a problem, because you don't want to leave any festering issue, because everybody will lose if that is the case. I certainly think that I think the rule book's been important. I think the communication has been crucial. I think the ownership of the vision, and that is whether that's management, family, or any other stakeholder, terms of what we're trying to achieve, and making sure that everybody is aligned has allowed us to take the right decisions with the right timelines, and not had pressure applied because of some externality or some particular family issue that might have caused strategy to be pulled offline simply to deal with a family problem. And so again, that goes to transparency, good communication, good understanding of what we're doing. And I think also, I think it's fair to involve the next generation. I think many family businesses, in my experience, it's an incredibly difficult balance between wanting another generation to get involved because of pride and because of continuity, but the balance between that and then putting too much pressure and expectation on them that is the choice that's already been made for them simply by virtue of the fact that they were born into the family. So keeping that balance is incredibly important. And I think one of the ways to do, we've found, is certainly not to put excessive pressure on our children, and certainly allow them to spread their wings and do what they want to do, and really not having the discussion about coming back into the business until they've gained experience. And we're now in that position. We have children in their 30s, so we're now in the position where they are beginning to think about what they really want to do in their life, where they want to settle down, where they want to have a family, how they want to sort of live their lives, and we become, I think, a relevant part of that decision tree for them. And I think that's important. I think that's very important. We've avoided putting too much pressure on, but it doesn't mean one doesn't start the discussion and start the planning, because one never wants to get surprises. Surprises both in terms of unmet expectations on either side of the fence, as it were, and because the business requires us to have the succession, as you say, in place in order to make sure that the business is healthy for the employees, for the other stakeholders, and everyone else involved.
So challenges never end, and this journey never ends. So what is the biggest challenge that you're facing as the head of the family right now?
Yeah, look, I think the most pressing issues, and one accepts that as a CEO, you've always got pressing issues. You've always got 100 fires to put out, and there's always a temptation to be, running around trying to put out the fires and not necessarily thinking a little bit along the longer term. But there's no doubt that the world economy is in some challenging space right now. But there are specific issues in the alcohol industry, the wine industry, whether that's related to wine and health, that need to be addressed, or whether that's to younger generations of consumers that are consuming less but consuming better quality. And we've been fortunate to position ourselves in the top end of the business. So essentially, people are coming towards us, but that doesn't mean we should be complacent. And I think the other point is, we sell our ports and wines in 103 countries around the world, and all of those are representing a different dynamic and a different challenges, whether those be distribution, consumer habits, the cultural issues, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a huge amount to be thinking about, and trying to make sure that we're properly aligned for. And making sure that one's got enough sort of brain space to make sure that as a CEO, one's thinking about some of the longer term strategic issues rather than simply all that short term firefighting, which is always going to be there.
That's what makes it so tough for a family business leader to lead a company, because you also have to deal and lead the family, and you address most of the challenges as business challenges, But I'm sure there's a bunch of also family challenges they also have to take care. So you have your plate full. In that sense, what would you name the biggest challenge in terms of the family unity?
Yeah, look, the biggest single family issue is about managing expectations. And that's always the hardest piece because, in a sense, everybody's got their own idea of what should or shouldn't be happening. And as I say, very often they feel that because their family members that they have a right to create their opinion, and they should. I think one has to be careful that those opinions have a forum where they can be safely discussed and not confuse the operational part of the business. And that goes back to my analogy borrowed from our original consultants of not having people in the cockpit. So I think that's very, very important to make sure there is a strong dividing line, but in order to achieve that, you've got to make sure that people feel that they're being heard about their concerns and issues and their priorities, that they have a proper forum to discuss that. Hence, we have a chairman of our executive family business committee that isn't me, and that gives them an outlet to go and talk to somebody that is not the person running the business or chairing the business itself, but where they make sure that their voice is properly heard. And I think it's, and again, it comes back, and then it's communication. Most human problems come down to poor communication.
Well, thank you very much, Adrian, for taking the time to be this open and honest in terms of communication with me. I'm sure next time we'll meet, we'll have a glass of Porto in Porto.
I certainly hope
for sure. And I wish you the best and success for your family and your business. Finally, Adrian, what do you take out of this conversation?
Well, Alex, I think it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I think you're doing a great job raising these sorts of issues and being able to bring different people's experience to a family audience. I think it's really tough. I mean, you just made that point. There's a tough enough world as a CEO, but there's a really tough, also additional layer of dynamic, which is family business. And yet family business make up the majority of the businesses across the world. So your podcast and your ability to have people share experiences, I think it's great. I think if that stimulates, even a single thought in one of the listeners to today's podcast, or stimulates them to finally take the plunge and to deal with the issue of succession or the issue of putting a rule book or whatever it might be, then I think today's conversation will have been a great success. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And yes, I look forward to sharing a glass or two of wonderful port wine, whether it's our Taylor's brand, our Fonseca brand, our Croft brand, and whether it's here in the beautiful city of Porto or wherever we have a chance to meet in the world. But thanks very much for the opportunity to chat.
You're also always welcome in Mexico. If not a Porto, we'll have a tequila here.
Exactly. I would love to learn more about tequila. And maybe we can come up with a cocktail that mixes tequila and port.
Why not? I'll think it over. Thank you very much, Adrian. Have an incredible day.
Yeah. Thanks very much for your time. Cheers then.
After speaking with Adrian Bridge, I am reminded of something fundamental. Longevity is not about age, it's about adaptation. A 334-year-old company survives. Here are some of the most powerful lessons from this conversation. First, family unity requires structure. 25 years ago, the family created new rules of engagement with protocol, clear governance, defined valuation mechanisms, not because they had a crisis, but because they wanted clarity. Second, ownership must be liquid enough to prevent resentment. They created a transparent valuation system so family members could exit with dignity. You can leave the company, you can sell your shares, but you never leave the family. That distinction is profound. Third, merit over bloodline. Adrian was not born into the business. He was invited because he was the most qualified. And when asked whether a woman could lead the company in the future? His answer was simple: the best qualified. That mindset is what protects continuity. Fourth, governance is not a one-time event. Advisory boards, independent directors, ongoing evaluation, continuous pruning. A tree that grows 334 years is a tree that is cared for. And finally, succession never ends. Every generation must prepare the next, not just financially, but culturally, intellectually, and emotionally. That is continuity. If in this episode sparked something in you, if it made comfortable or inspired or reflective, I invite you to subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, follow us on Spotify, and most importantly, engage. Tell me, what families should we learn from next? What topics matter most for you? What challenge are you navigating on your own company? You can reach out directly. This platform exists to create meaningful conversations. And once again, thank you to the London Consulting Group for supporting this place. I have seen firsthand how they help family companies execute strategy without losing their identity. Because continuity is not just about survival, it's about discipline, evolution. A family business that not survives 334 years by accident. It survives because someone in every generation decides to think beyond themselves. I'll see you in the next conversation.
Y hablando de crecimiento real, en London Consulting Group, creemos que la transformación comienza cuando los líderes deciden actuar. Growth Stories, una serie que presenta casos de éxito de líderes que transforman visión y estrategia en acción. Descúbrelo en nuestro canal de YouTube y landing page. Hoy observas, mañana puedes liderar el próximo Growth Story, reimaginando los resultados, redefiniendo el futuro. London Consulting Group.